Well, good morning, everybody. How are we doing? Welcome to a slightly warmer day in Raleigh, and welcome back to the convention center. For you that were here yesterday, did you enjoy the day? All right, well, good to hear. We're going to launch into another great day full of content. If you want to go to govtech.com, go to the event tab, click on the North Carolina Cyber event. You can see a full listing of session titles, descriptions, speakers. We really do have a impressive list of folks today. So as you all know, yesterday was the AI-centric day. Today, day 2 is going to be more focused around cybersecurity and privacy initiatives. And we have a great day planned ahead. So for those of you that don't know me or this is your first day, my name is Zach Thorne. I am with eRepublic, which is the parent organization of Government Technology Magazine, Governing Magazine, the Center for Digital Government, and the Center for Public Sector AI, which is our newly launched initiative as of last year. So I do want to thank a few folks, and then we're going to go ahead and get rolling for today. We have a lot to talk about. I want to thank the team at DIT again for working so hard to get these 2 days rolling, and all of our great speakers involved. I want to thank our sponsor partners have helped put these 2 days together as well, thought leadership, and their support. So if we can give a big round of applause for everybody that helped make these 2 days happen. And please remember to say hi to our friends on the other side of the wall throughout today, too. So I'd like to kick off today by welcoming again up to the stage Secretary Weaver. Again, he's been a great partner with us for many years, and we're excited to launch into our Security Day. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Secretary Weaver to the stage.
Okay, Lisa, are you plugged in over there so before we throw the fuse breaker again? Okay. We don't know if that's what actually happened, but we're going to go with that story because it's going to be a good memory. So welcome everybody to day 2. It's good to see so many folks here. Just a quick show of hands again. How many are our local government folks that are here in the room? Okay, a little bit less than yesterday. How about state? Oh my gosh, is anybody doing anything in North Carolina today? The state offices? I mean, we're all here. Okay, fantastic. Well, again, take the opportunity today to network with your local government peers, local government network with your state government peers. This is a great opportunity for us to be together. As we're looking at the topic of cyber and privacy today, yesterday we did focus a lot on artificial intelligence, and AI, I jokingly refer to it, it's like the Force in Star Wars. There's the good side of the Force and there's the bad side of the Force. And as with any new technology, there's obviously really good things that you can do with it, and then unfortunately there's really bad things that can occur as well. And so when we think about this technology, the guide rails, or if you will, the boundaries of how successful we are, it's going to be around cyber and it's going to be around privacy. As we talked a lot yesterday, it's about data, our data readiness, our data classifications, and all that ties back into the privacy cyber theme. So today we're going to give you a heavy dosage of cyber and privacy related topics and discussions. I've heard from many of you here in the room and from yesterday as well as how pleased and great this event has been for all of us. If you only knew how close we were to seeing this event not happen, it's really amazing how well it kind of like anybody remember the A-Team, since we've been playing a lot of 70s music? George Papard saying, "I love it when a plan comes together." That's exactly what happened here. So the fact that, we have Cherie, we have Torry, Crass for today, really putting together a lot of the agenda. Yesterday was really focused a lot with Christy Burris as our data officer, Keith Briggs as our enterprise architect around the AI themes. So again, very thankful, and our comms team for really doing a lot of the communication and things of that nature, and obviously Zach and his team from eRepublic as well. So we're really glad to have been able to bring you this venue. And then also, please take advantage, if you were not here yesterday, go out and talk to our sponsors that are out there in the hallway, stop by their booths, have a conversation with them, because this event would not be possible without their participation, and probably more importantly, their contribution to making this venue, the refreshments and different things that we have at our disposal. It's our supplier community here that has really come through at the end of, if you think about it, most of them had to stay in their fiscal years, and marketing dollars are very, very rare. So we're very appreciative of the fact that those that were able to go through their couches, scrape some pennies, and come here and help us out in North Carolina. Thank you very much to our partners. As we move forward with today's events, I want to bring up to the stage here in a minute Cherie Givens, or I should say Dr. Cherie Givens. We were very fortunate a couple years ago as we created the Office of Privacy and Data. I should say it's Office of Data and Privacy. How do we have you phrased now? Data protection. Okay, thank you. You know, I got to meet Cherie, and it was kind of funny because I didn't know her name was pronounced Cherie. I said Cherie, and she just looked at me with the smile she always has and goes, "Jim, my name is Cherie, and I'm only correcting you because we're going to have a long relationship together." And how true that was. So Cherie is, if you don't know, has a PhD. She's been published in a number of privacy books. I think she's written a book or two on her own. She's also in many textbooks that actually talk about privacy that are used across college campuses. Herself, unfortunately, she's an LSU graduate, so yeah, we got to kind of, as we look at sports teams, we give her a little thing about being from LSU, but otherwise, we were so blessed to be able to convince her to come down from the DC area, the concrete jungle, and to start establishing the privacy program here in the state of North Carolina. So without further ado, let me invite up on the stage here Cherie Givens to give a couple of remarks. Cherie?
Wow, what a great introduction. Well, so I'll try to keep mine short, although Jim says that that's hard for me to do. I just want to talk just briefly about the relationship. So I know the first day was about AI, and when we talk about AI, one of the things that I think we need to think about is about looking at it holistically. So not just looking at it from the perspective of what can it do for us and, you know, maybe its new features, but to look at it across the spectrum and to think about the different things that we need to be taken into consideration, right? What data we're using, what kind of information we may be giving away that we're not aware of, and also to think about, and I hope that people are familiar with this, with our fair information practice principles. So at the state, we adopted fair information practice principles, and these principles stem from the Privacy Act of 1975. Right? And the reason that that's from so long ago is that is coordinating with when we started to use people's personal information in computer systems. And so they got together and thought about what is important, how should we be treating people, and how should we be treating their data. And this is what informs how we look at it at the state and how we should be thinking about it as we move into this new technology. It's just another form of technology, and we still have to be treating people's data not only in what we consider to be fair, but also in the way that people expect. So one of the things that I hear often is, well, North Carolina doesn't have a privacy law, a comprehensive privacy law. We do have privacy laws, right? Laws that impact the privacy of our citizens and our residents, but at the same time, we have to look at our reputation. So as state entities and as local entities, people give us their information, and we're in that position where they have to give it in order to get certain services, and that differentiates us from private industry. And so in my mind, we have a higher duty, right? If your grandmother, if your cousin, if your child has to provide information in order to get the basic necessities that they need to either get care that they need or any kind of thing that you need in the state, right? It's important that we keep that in mind and that we try to live up to that expectation as best as we can. While it's true that we don't have that law, we don't have a comprehensive privacy law, nothing prevents us from doing the right thing and from taking that approach. So I'll say this, privacy and cybersecurity work closely together, we're partners. And all the things that we do, and it needs to be that way everywhere that it's occurring, right? So some of the things that we do is that when we work on things like AI, if we see that something is going on and one or the other of us needs to be involved, we do that. We bring the other person in or the other office in. You should always be thinking about both sides of it. Privacy is looking more at what's going on inside, how we're using the data internally, right? Who has a need to know, who should be looking at it, and whether or not we're using the data in the way that it was intended to be used. So with all of that said, I think that we'll be talking today about this holistic approach, and I'm looking forward to having these discussions with all of y'all, and I am thrilled to see everyone that's here today. And happy holidays to everyone. And with all that said, I'd love to introduce our Chief Risk Officer, Torry Crass, my partner and a great asset to the state. Thank you so much.
Morning, everybody. Just curious, before we get started and I introduce our keynote, how many folks were here yesterday? Welcome back. Thank you for showing up for day 2. Hope today's sessions are as interesting as some of the great stuff that we had yesterday. I'm sure they will be. So I wanted to just kind of go right into the intro for our keynote this morning. So I'm here to introduce our keynote. I've known Jeff Mann for quite a while. We were actually talking about this last night, trying to figure out when it was that we first actually met, and got back to it at least about 10 years ago, and then kind of worked through a little bit of we met at this conference and had these conversations. So suffice to say, it's been quite a while. And if you look up Jeff, you're going to find some very technical industry terms affiliated with him: curmudgeon, cyber legend, and OG hacker. So this, I can say, is definitely accurate in all the best ways. And Jeff is truly a leader and respected within the cyber community at large. He's an advisor, an evangelist, and a co-host for Paul's Security Weekly, Tribe of Hackers, and Darknet Diaries. So with that, I'd like to welcome Jeff Mann to the stage for our keynote this morning. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. I have a lot of slides to cover. Oh, you guys started me 15 minutes early. Thank you very much. I will use that time. Make sure everything is set up technology-wise. Oh, I need to have my slides up on the screen. In the meantime, I'll just sit here and stare at you. It went to sleep. Something's happening.
Well, you had 15 minutes.
I did have 15 minutes.
There you go.
Hey, there it is. All right, here we go. Make sure that works. All right, so good morning. My name is Jeff Mann. I want to start off by getting you guys involved, and this is a day that we're focusing on cybersecurity and privacy, so it has a lot to do with computers and the internet and things like that. Does anybody know the significance of this date? If you do, just shout it out. Anyone. Don't be bashful. I can't hear you. Shout louder. No. Good guess. Anyone else? Give up? All right, I got a brief introduction, but I want to tell you a little bit about myself. This is my information. Feel free to contact me at any time. I do try to give back to the community because I have been around a long time. I've decided I've been in this business now for more than a generation. I sort of represent the first generation of what we now call cybersecurity. Very briefly, I've been in the business of what we used to call information security over 40 years, dating back to the early 80s. I sort of cut my teeth working for the DoD, spent a good deal of time at the National Security Agency. I'll talk a little bit about that. Came out into the private sector almost 30 years ago now. I've been working in the private sector since about 1996, and that's part of what we're talking about today. My career spans a lot of different industries and verticals and markets because I've been a sort of a cybersecurity expert going in and talking to companies of whatever background, which is kind of fun because then I get to see different things. I've even done work with governments, although I do prefer the private sector. Please don't be offended by that. You probably know why. Very briefly, I work for a company called Online Business Systems, or OBS. It's actually Canadian-based, but my boss, who I've worked with off and on for years, ended up going to work there, starting a risk, security, and privacy practice. He brought me on board about 6 years ago, and he lets me come around and speak at conferences like this and sort of give back to the community and try to teach and educate the history of where we've come from in cybersecurity, because as we look to the future, and we're going to have a whole day today where we're talking about cybersecurity and privacy, I think it's important to know where we've come from. And I talk a lot at conferences, and the feedback I get is, yeah, it is important to know the history. So bear with me. It's sort of my personal story, but my personal story does correspond to and overlap and is a significant part of the history of cybersecurity. As Torry mentioned, I do a podcast called Paul's Security Weekly, or you can just simply find it at securityweekly.com, or if you go to any of the podcast applications and just search for Security Weekly, you should be able to find us. It's a weekly show. I'm not on it every week. We broadcast, well, we used to broadcast live. We record every Wednesday. I was not available yesterday, so I wasn't on it this week. And importantly, I want to let you know that I do identify as a hacker. I didn't always call myself that. Even when I was doing pen testing back for the National Security Agency, which I'll talk a little bit about, in the early 90s, I was, and the small group of guys I was working with, we were trying to be hackers. We were trying to emulate hackers. We were trying to live the lifestyle of hackers. It wasn't until many years later that I just sort of embraced that, no, I really am a hacker. During COVID, I had a lot of free time, and I organized my closet, and one of the things I did was hang up all my black hoodies. One of our listeners on Security Weekly helped me organize it even further. Torry mentioned Tribe of Hackers. Tribe of Hackers is a series of books that were published primarily before COVID. Everything is either before or after COVID, it seems. And then there's this gap. But it's a book that the editors went around to people that are influencers in the industry and people that have made a difference in the industry, and everybody got to fill out a survey, a questionnaire, and every chapter in each of these books is a different person answering the same questions. The original book, Tribe of Hackers, was simply, how'd you get into security? Esoteric things like what's your favorite movie, or what books do you recommend? But also things like successes and failures. What do you think's right and wrong with the industry? And getting that perspective from, I think in the first book, 70 different people, very fascinating book. I do not get paid if you go out and buy it. I don't get royalties or anything like that, but very interesting reads. There's a red team edition, a blue team edition, a leadership edition, and the original. And I'm only one of two people that are in all four books. So if you're curious as to who the other person is, of course, you have to go out and buy the books. Notice my shirt. Notice the artwork. There is a podcast out there called Darknet Diaries that tells the stories of people that have had good and bad experiences with the law and with the industry, from a hacking perspective. A lot of the hacking in the early days was just people fumbling around trying to figure out how things worked and what they could break into and where they could go, and sometimes they got in trouble and sometimes they didn't. I was fortunate enough to be asked to be on episode 83, and I was even more fortunate to find out that the Darknet Diaries e-commerce website, they have a few t-shirts and hoodies and things like that, and they actually had the artwork from my episode available on a t-shirt, so why not? Life goal, get on Darknet Diaries and then get the artwork on a t-shirt. I call myself also a curmudgeon, and it's not just a title because I'm a grumpy old man. I'm actually a member of a small cabal, we call it, of pretty much industry old-timers and pioneers. The main curmudgeon, the gentleman kind of in a sport jacket, kind of a pinkish-looking shirt. I guess I could use my laser pointer if I could figure out how to do it. That guy. Gene Spafford, he is the true pioneer of internet security. He wrote the book that I learned from back in the early 90s. He's been involved in what we used to call distributed systems since the 70s. So he predates me by at least 10 years. For many years, he had been gathering at RSA conference with a group of friends, people that are old timers. I was invited to join. I was nominated, and I had to present my case and got voted in, and that happened in 2017. So I am officially a member of the cabal of the curmudgeons. Our mantra is basically, we're old, we're cynical, we're bitter, but we haven't completely given up hope, so we keep trying. So the reason this talk has the title Tales from the Crypt Analyst, the Afterlife, years ago I gave a talk on the early years of my career at NSA, and I was working for a vendor at the time in the marketing department, so I had access to a summer intern, and I talked them into making me some graphics to advertise this talk. If you're old enough to remember comic books, there's a comic book used to be called Tales from the Crypt, so I played on that and had them make this art. So Tales from the Crypt Analyst was the first talk I gave about the early days at NSA. I am a certified crypt analyst from NSA. That's the only certification I really admit to and I'm proud of. Because of the industry certifications, well, that's a whole different topic, never mind. I started work at NSA in 1986, and it was a time in our history where things were transitioning. Computers were around, the internet wasn't really a thing yet. My first job, I had a desktop IBM PC, didn't even have a hard drive. Then one day I got a hard drive, 10 megabits if I recall. And I was like, wow, how's anybody ever gonna fill up that? That's like 20,000 pages, because back in those days, all you did was really word processing. But I went to work for an office at NSA that was called Manual Crypto Systems, and they trained me to be a cryptologist because they wanted me to try to break into the manual crypto systems that the US was using, that NSA produced and distributed. Because it was right around the time of computers becoming a thing, I was approached by a customer saying, we have this thing called a one-time pad. A one-time pad is basically key is written down on paper, and the way you encrypt a message is one letter at a time. One letter for the character that's the key that's printed on the paper. You do some sort of algorithm to get a third letter, and then you reverse it on the other side. There's 2 copies of the key, 2 one-time pads. The security of it is keep those pads secret, don't get it stolen, don't get it copied. And back in those days, keeping things secret mostly had to do with communications. In fact, the InfoSec organization that I worked for was originally called Communication Security. So customer, one-time pad, they're working with people that are, let's say, perhaps recruited in areas of Eastern Europe. This was during the Cold War, and they were producing situation reports and providing information. So the customer said, it takes us hours to do these messages, to decrypt them, but there's this PC sitting on the desk. Isn't there some way we could use this? And I was like, I don't see why not. Now, senior members of NSA management and executives and really smart people that wore suits and ties and had pocket protectors and they used slide rules to do their calculations. Google what a slide rule is if you're younger. They said, we don't do software. And I thought, well, why not? So I figured out a way to work through the system and get the key that was on the one-time pad put onto a floppy disk. I found somebody that could write a program that could do the encryption-decryption algorithm. The trickiest part was when you use a page of the one-time pad, in order to keep it secure, you destroy it. People in the field, their one-time pad was sometimes only about an inch and a half big and would literally fit in the heel of your shoe because it was designed for that. And it was printed on rice paper, so they would eat it. You've probably seen James Bond movies or spy movies where they do stuff like that. It was real. Anyway, long story short, got this thing produced. I had to present it to senior management, sort of a board of directors for the whole InfoSec organization. I was a young person in my 20s talking to a bunch of old men, 50s, 60s. Of course, I'm that age now. They were very spry old men. But they were engineers, they were computer scientists, they were mathematicians, and they were very set in their ways. But I was able to push this thing through. To my knowledge, it was the first software-based crypto system that NSA produced. When I presented it, the chairman of the board, the senior manager of the organization said to me, okay, we'll let you do this, because I met all their expectations. I met all the obstacles. But he said to me, don't ever do this again. So that's out there. The other thing notably that I did in this first couple years was I was working with another client also using one-time pads. The algorithm that they used was something that they would memorize. It's something based on what's called a visionaire square, which is the alphabet row and column and a reverse of the alphabet filling in the grid, but at one letter offset for each row. If it doesn't make sense, Google it. But anyway, it's a way to combine three characters. I figured out a way to do that on a wheel, a cipher wheel, because I had learned about cipher wheels, the Little Orphan Annie decoder ring. Ended up getting a bunch of these produced, and they were used by the customer for at least a decade, the customer being U.S. Special Forces. I had the distinction this year of getting a copy of my wheel put into the National Cryptologic Museum, which is the NSA museum. So there I am seeing my wheel on display in the museum. So they were excited to have the wheel because most of the stuff in the museum, the people that designed these things have been dead for decades, if not centuries. So it was an exciting time for me, and I'm in a museum. All of that is in Tales from the Crypt Analyst. If you want to hear more stories about that and the fuller stories of those things, it's out on YouTube. There's several versions of it. I gave this talk probably back in 2015 or 16, maybe 17. So you can find that. That's Tales from the Crypt Analyst. Another date to remember, and this is one that you really should know because this date is why you are here today. Anybody want to guess? I always stump everybody. Internet was created? That's close. You're getting warmer. It was the day where the first publicly available web browser was published, something called Mosaic. And yeah, it's what brought the internet to the masses. And it's really the reason why we're here today. So remember that date. That means this whole industry, as we know it, has only been around a little bit more than 30 years. And it just so happens that during this time, 1993, I was working for a different organization within InfoSec at NSA. I had become an intern, a cryptanalysis intern. I had gone over to the operations side of the house and actually done real code breaking and all that kind of stuff that NSA at least used to be known for. My last intern tour was back on InfoSec, working for an organization called Fielded Systems Evaluations. This organization was doing testing, security testing, trying to break, kind of like hacking, all the systems that NSA had produced and designed because somebody figured out, hey, the way that we very often exploit our adversaries' communications is we take advantage of the fact that they don't use them correctly. Like a one-time pad cannot be broken mathematically or cryptographically. Every possible solution is just as valid as any other. But if you take that one-time pad and start using it for a day or for a week and for multiple messages, you're introducing cryptographic vulnerabilities that make it vulnerable. Machine systems were common back in those days, not digital yet, but actual mechanical machines. There were switches and settings and keys that had to be physically inserted, and the people that usually ran and operated these things, the radio officers, the communications officers, they were usually young kids, and they wanted to get the message through. So they would find shortcuts, bypasses, they'd skip steps, as long as they could get the message through. So all of that knowledge was applied to, let's start looking at our own systems. I went to work for that organization about the time that the internet was becoming publicly available, and a small group of us were looking already at networked systems. That was the name of the division that I was in within this office. And we said, we ought to start learning how to do hacking. We ought to learn how to do this computer hacking thing. We've seen it in movies. Let's try to figure out how to do it. So we set out to become hackers, learn how to be hackers, learn how to do hacking. We are memorialized forever in a book that came out, I think in 2015, called Dark Territory. In chapter 4 of that book, which is entitled Eligible Receiver, there's a paragraph, and I always like to do a dramatic reading here. So I might be able to read it from here better. It says in the middle there that during its most sensitive drills, the red team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed, and even they couldn't enter without first passing through 2 combination locked doors. I don't know if that's true. All I know is the guys that I worked with that were learning how to do pen testing, we got relocated and reorganized, put in a new building, and we nicknamed our office the Pit, because the Pit, we were trying to live this hacker lifestyle and be edgy and different, and we're like, we need to name our office. So somewhere between us, 5 or 6 guys working in an office doing pen testing, we called it pen testing back then, not red teaming. Between that and 2015, somehow there was some folklore that went on, but the Pit is really 6 guys. There was initial 4 guys, a couple people came later. I still need to update this slide. It used to be 2 of the guys still worked at NSA, but one of them has since retired in the last couple years. 4 of us are out in the private sector in some way, shape, or form. 2 of those people wish to remain anonymous. I don't have their permission to share who they are. The one that I do have the permission to talk about, the gentleman pictured here, is a man named Ron Gula. Ron Gula was amongst other things, the founder of a startup company called Tenable Network Security, which produces still a vulnerability scanning tool called Nessus. So if you've ever heard of Nessus, it goes back to Ron Gula. And he worked with me in the Pit. Let me see how I'm doing on time. I don't want to get too comfortable with the extra 15 minutes. Oh, I'm doing great. I have like 120 slides to go through. These are some of the books that we use to learn our trade. I mentioned Gene Spafford. That's his book that he wrote, Practical Unix and Internet Security, with his colleague Simpson Garfinkel. Another great book, Firewalls and Internet Security. Notice that back then it was called Internet Security. This is early 90s. Cheswick and Bellavin, they basically wrote a book about detecting people in their networks on their mainframe and trying to figure out how they got in and how to stop them, how to repel them, as the name implies. And of course, the most famous book for a lot of us in our industry in terms of inspiration is a book called The Cuckoo's Egg, written by Cliff Stahl, his experiences in being I want to say he's an astronomer, some sort of very smart person at one of those California universities. And this incident actually happened in the 80s, where mainframes existed at the time, and to get time on the mainframe, you had to sign up for it, and every department had to pay for it. So he was going through his monthly mainframe bill, and he noticed a discrepancy of like 70 cents or $1 or something like that. And being very diligent and a little bit quirky, I think these days we would probably say he's got some sort of autism, which a lot of us do in this industry, at least in the hacker community. He dug into it and tried to figure out where this thing came from, and ended up figuring out that there were East German hackers that were breaking into his university's mainframe and stealing government secrets. Because back in those days, a lot of research was done at universities, and they were done for the federal government under contract, and a lot of it was intelligence-based, and a lot of it was very super secret. So his experiences of figuring this out and trying to report it to somebody that knew nothing about computer security and computing hacking, going to the FBI, going to the CIA, even going to NSA, is all recorded in a book. And there's, I think you can find it on YouTube. There used to be a science show on TV called Nova, and Nova did a special on his story many years ago. Look for it on YouTube, just the cuckoo's egg. He actually played himself on Nova in the movie. Real quirky dude. I actually got to meet him a couple years ago. He was a keynote at another conference I went to, so I had one of those fanboy moments, but a very interesting guy. I put this slide in because I know this guy, a gentleman named Win Schwartau. He's been writing about cybersecurity and the dangers of putting everything on the internet, putting everything in the cloud, what's going to happen, pretty much since the 80s, early 90s. I got to know him over the years, and he was at a conference earlier this year. We have a term in the hacker community called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and we like to talk about disparagingly about vendors trying to sell their products using fear, uncertainty, and doubt. The sky is falling. You've got to have one of these. No, you got to have 6 of these, otherwise bad things are going to happen. And that's very real in terms of marketing pitches even to this day. And one of the things that we all have to do better and learn about is to how to pick through those types of messages and find out what the real dangers are versus the fear, the uncertainty, and the doubt. Very briefly, we were doing this for a couple years. It was kind of a new thing within the government, within the whole world, frankly. And we were initially doing our security testing for classified systems, NSA-based systems, and networks, and let's say our customers, mostly military bases that were communicating back to NSA and doing all sorts of secret stuff. But somehow word got out to the rest of the community that we were doing this thing, that we had this new kind of fangled thing that nowadays we would call a red team exercise. And somewhere along the line, we got asked by the Department of Justice, which was running an unclassified network and unclassified systems, at least not intelligence-based systems. They asked us if we could come in and do we called it a vulnerability and threat assessment back in those days officially. The problem was because DOJ was an unclassified network, the organization in government that was responsible for unclassified networks at that time was NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. NSA could only do classified networks. So even though they asked, we had to go through this whole process, this exception process that took months to get to the point where we could actually do the work. It was acknowledged back in those days that NIST didn't really have that much capability in this area, and so they very routinely would turn things over to the experts at NSA for anything computer, networking, mainframe related. But there was a process that you had to go through. You guys are government, you know that there's processes, there's rules, there's things that have to go through. We ultimately got to the point where we had all our ducks in a row, and we drafted a letter. I drafted a letter that was going to be signed and was signed by the director of the NSA at the time, General Kenneth Minahan. You can see my name down there at the bottom. And notice the date. That was 21 August 1996. We probably first started talking to the Department of Justice in April. So it was like a 3-month process to get here. I believe the 21st of August was a Thursday. Thursday or Friday. I got into the office the Monday morning before that date, that letter hadn't even been delivered yet. Monday morning, this is what had happened over the weekend. I got a phone call from the Department of Justice saying, help, we've been hacked. The very first compromise, the very first breach of a government website. It was horrible. It was, the sky was falling. It was the end of the world because the government, who of all entities should know security and be protected and do things right on the internet, they were breached. There's archives of this out there. You can see the whole thing. You scroll down and it gets a little bit racy. Janet Reno was the what's the cabinet level position? Janet Reno was in power at the time. They replaced her picture with right down there Adolf Hitler, and then it gets a little bit more off color. But that happened over the weekend before we could deliver the letter to say, we're authorized and we can start doing the testing. The customer simply said, we've been attacked. Can you help us? And so I said, well, let me see what I can do. I hung up the phone, called our lawyers, we call them general counsel, and explained to them what had happened and said, there's got to be some way we can get somebody there on the ground to help them tomorrow. I mean, we're that close to being legal and authorized to go do what we were going to do, so surely we can sort of speed up this process and not take 3 months to go help them. So I was able to pull a team together, and we went down on Tuesday to DC to the DOJ offices. We were there Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I get a phone call saying, Jeff, excuse me, French, I'm just quoting history. Jeff, the shit's hit the fan. You guys got to drop what you're doing and come back now. So we did. We got marched into the deputy director's conference room and proceeded to be read the Riot Act by the same lawyers that I'd been working with. Because I was the ringleader, I was put on double secret probation. They were they pulled my clearances. I wasn't allowed to be on my network. My account was locked. Of course, they didn't know hackers, if you sit them in front of a computer terminal, they're going to get in, but that's another story. All that to say is, while things were going really well, all of a sudden it kind of blew up and it got very political and bureaucratic. And I found out many years later, one of the gentlemen in the picture of the cabal of the curmudgeons was actually the lawyer that I had been working with, and the lawyer that had yelled at us and said, you're in trouble, and gotten me in trouble. I ran into him at a DEF CON probably 6 or 7 years ago, and the first thing he said to me was, I forgive you. And I'm like, why are you forgiving me? I've been pissed off at you for the last 20 some odd years because you've turned on me. Turns out he got into a whole lot more trouble than I did, and he was doing a lot of air cover for me and for our team. So he took a lot of the daggers and knives in the back on our behalf. So we talked through it. One of the things he told me was they weren't even trying to just fire me. They wanted to prosecute me. They wanted to prosecute me for committing treason, because NSA, at least at the time, this is pre-9/11, pre-Patriot Act, had this pesky little charter that said basically NSA doesn't do what NSA can do to U.S. citizens. And so I was violating that sacred, sacrosanct mission statement that had come from the government, come from Congress. So what happened, though, was a month later, I left NSA and I came out into the private sector. I left rather abruptly. More of that whole story, in fact, I tell the whole story about how we started doing pen testing, how we sort of built up a tool set, how we figured out a methodology and turned it into something that was repeatable that we could go out and present to clients. That's all presented in more Tales from the Crypt Analyst, which again, you can find recordings of that on YouTube in various iterations. I like to think of this as what I took away from my career at NSA. I did things that I wasn't supposed to be able to do, like created a software-based crypto system, started doing pen testing and figured out a way to do it. Instead of taking months to get permission, we could do it in a couple of hours or days. But this brings us up to this talk. That's all background. That was all prologue. I left in '96, So this talk now is the next couple years. I know this is public sector, and you may not know much about something called PCI, the payment card industry, but that's a security standard that protects credit cards. It's private. It was originally put together by the card brands, and it was first published in 2004. So this, at the beginning of the year, I put together this talk thinking in this year, 2024, PCI pushed out version 4, its new version. So I thought, I need to give a talk about PCI, but then I thought nobody likes to hear about PCI, so let me give a talk on how I got from being an NSA hacker, pen tester, cryptographer, to doing PCI. So that's what I'm going to share with you for the next few minutes. Still doing pretty good. 1996, there weren't that many companies doing cybersecurity. There weren't a lot of vendors that were focused on doing cybersecurity. There were a lot of government contractors, there were a lot of technology companies. I don't even think we were calling them IT yet, but there were a lot of companies that would help out and do stuff. There were, I live in Maryland, that's where NSA is. There were a lot of companies that did work with NSA, did classified work. A lot of these companies were founded by former NSA employees and so on and so forth. And I had been, as well as other people in the pit, been sort of feeling around, looking for opportunities in the private sector, because there are problems working for a bureaucratic government organization. We were frustrated that it would take weeks and months to get permission to do what we knew we could do in moments, especially back in those days, in terms of breaking into systems and stealing secrets or just showing how it could be done. So I had been going out on some interviews, but I left rather abruptly. If you know federal government, the fiscal year ends in September, so I left right at the end of the fiscal year. I actually got a buyout. They did a buyout, and so they paid me to leave, which I thought was ironic at the time. But I ended up working for a company, going to work for a company that doesn't even exist anymore, Computer Sciences Corporation. It didn't last very long. The people that had hired me that wanted to start a commercial information security consulting, pen testing, vulnerability assessment type of practice, they were doing government work. The guys that hired me, they resigned right after I went to work for them to go off and start their own thing somewhere else. So I was just kind of there and nobody knew what to do with me. So that job didn't last very long. This is probably lost on most of you, but one of the people I worked with for a brief period of time is a pretty famous hacker in the hacker community that's written books on doing hacking, a guy named Johnny Long. I happened to work with him and got to know him years before he became famous, writing books and stuff like that. But I ended up going to work for another government contractor that was in the area that, again, was trying to break into the commercial sector, because back then, the internet was new and everybody was trying to figure out, how can we do business on the internet? How can we monetize this? How can we take advantage of, it was a green field, they like to say. So I went to work for an organization. I actually had 4 job offers finally because I took my time. But I went to work for this organization because I thought we had the best shot of sort of building something from the ground up. Again, a company that doesn't exist anymore. In fact, that company got acquired by CSC, which in turn got acquired by, I forget who. Somebody Google it. So we set up a practice, and back then there wasn't really a lot going on with cybersecurity. It was, you're going to plug into the internet, you're going to start using the internet as a backbone for your organization, which already has a network. You need to protect yourself from the internet. How did you do that back then? With a firewall. Believe it or not, organizations back then would plug into the internet without a firewall. And they would think they had some sort of security, like, well, there's so many systems out there, who would find us? We don't have anything to steal. But we did basically 4 things. We did the vulnerability assessments. We would come in and break in and show them how bad things were. We would do as like what we would call today a tabletop exercise. We don't have to break in. We could just sit down and talk to you and do a security risk review and start figuring out, what are your valuable assets? What do you have to protect in terms of data information or maybe reputation or systems or things that are valuable to you? We would do security architecture. We would help them redesign their network to put valuable things in small, isolated local area networks that were hopefully isolated away from the internet. And then finally, we would do just the firewall installations. In fact, we didn't do it. We outsourced that to another company because we were like, we're doing all this smart brain stuff. That's just menial labor. So we outsourced that to a third party. There's an organization called SANS around today. They were sort of getting their start back in the 90s. They used to put out these posters that was everything you needed to learn about cybersecurity at the time and all the different facets of it. There was a front and back to it. And this was a list of all the companies out there that did the different types of things that you need to do. Try to imagine fitting all the companies that are out there today on one poster. And this was like a 2 or 3 foot poster. Penetration testing was one of the services. You can see that my company was listed there, as well as at the time, wasn't a lot of specialty companies. It was mostly bigger companies, IT companies that were getting on the bandwagon and starting to have cybersecurity practices. Our methodology was pretty straightforward. We would talk to our clients, figure out who they were, what kind of company they were, try to get to know some of the people there, try to get to know names of employees, because back in those days, that wasn't necessarily public knowledge, wasn't necessarily privacy information, but just getting a valid credential, a valid user ID was valuable, because then if you knew somebody that worked at a company, you could start trying to guess passwords to break in, but you first had to have a valid user ID. So we would get to know the company. These days in modern vernacular, that's sometimes called open source intelligence, or OSINT. We just called it because we came from the military background, recon. And then we would eventually plug in and start probing. Again, back in those days, all the computers and networks and workstations and laptops and whatever, they were all publicly addressable. There wasn't this idea of private addressing yet. Everything had an IP address that was internet routable, internet reachable, unless you had something blocking you or something restricting your access. So we would try to figure out what the targets were. Company XYZ, what IP addresses do you own or lease? Is it a class A, a class B? How many addresses are there? How many systems are on there? So we would do some electronic discovery, network discovery, trying to probe what the targets are, and then trying to figure out what the weakest systems are that we could then finally try to break in. It's roughly the methodology that's followed by most red team companies today, although the technologies have changed, the targets have changed, but you're still starting with little to no information, trying to learn more, trying to pick your targets, trying to find a way to break in, and then ultimately trying to break in. Ironically, this methodology, at least the way we were building out, came from a movie that came out in 1992. Anybody know what the name is? It's written there in small print if you can read it. Sneakers. On our podcast, Paul's Security Weekly, Paul and I have this running contest of asking our guests what their favorite hacker movie is. Paul's favorite hacker movie is Hackers, Angelina Jolie, 1995. My favorite hacker movie is Sneakers, 1992. Of course, the original hacker movie is a movie called War Games, Matthew Broderick. Came out in 1983, 10 years before I was doing it at NSA. But this movie, Sneakers, pretty much spells out a methodology that's followed pretty much to this day, which is why I think it's the best hacker movie. But in that movie, the bad guy character, Ben Kingsley, says to the good guy character, Robert Redford, at the pivotal moment of the film, by the way, if you've never seen this film, make a point of seeing this film, because this is part of the history and this is part of understanding the motives and methods of the bad guys, even to this day. But in that movie, and this is where I want, listen to this, Ben Kingsley says, "There's a war out there, old friend, a world war. And it's not about who's got the most bullets. It's about who controls the information. What we see and hear, how we work, what we think. It's all about the information." 1992. Back then, all we worried about in terms of information was like name, address, phone number, maybe your bank account, credit card number. Nowadays, if you've got a mobile device on you, which I probably think everybody does, you've got GPS tracking, you've got your browsing habits, you've got what apps you're on, who you're talking to, We all know the phones are listening to every word we say, whether we admit it or not. 1992, they were onto something, the authors and writers of this movie. Anyway, a little bit more detail. I'm going to go through this pretty quick, but the details of what a site survey, what we call a site survey, involved, details of the network discovery, details of the penetration testing. Pretty straightforward, at least as far as we were concerned. We did it very much by hand back in those days. We were sort of proud of the fact that we did this all manually. It didn't scale well, and one of the changes in the evolutions of technology in general is because of the proliferation of technology and data that's flying through the air. We have to do automation. I still am a little bitter that there's so much automation built into pen testing these days, but I understand the necessity of it. But I still also believe that at the end of the day, you've got to have somebody with a brain, despite the AI discussions yesterday, that can make sense of what you're seeing. Maybe someday we're going to get there, that we don't need to do that, but then civilization won't be necessary anymore. And how many science fiction movies have we seen where the machines have come after us? You know, remember Skynet, my first slide. What was available back in the time? ISS, Internet Security Systems, was sort of the first commercial vulnerability scanner, this idea of automation. They had a bunch of different scanners that would scan different things. Because in the evolution of the internet, once you plugged into it and put a firewall up, you still wanted to use it as an organization or a company to engage in some sort of commerce. So you wanted to put up a website. So the website needed to be accessible by the internet, and you wanted to put stuff on the website, whether it was an e-commerce site or just an information site, usually from the back end. So as soon as you had protected yourself with a firewall, you put this side channel in, this back door, if you will, to get to your network potentially by putting a web server out there. So scanners came along, early intrusion detection, detecting nefarious, malicious, or suspicious activities. They had a product called Real Secure. Real Secure, the early marketers, they came up with the idea of doing a graphic novel. This is history. I apologize ahead of time if it gets a little bit off color, but the bad guy in the comic book, in the graphic novel, was not that evil demon-looking thing. It was the scantily clad vampirish woman. That evil-looking thing was the Real Secure good guy that was protecting us. And this graphic magazine was put out as marketing. I got it in the mail, and I'm like, this is interesting. I'm going to keep it. I still have it to this day. But somebody figured out very quickly, this is really not a good idea, so they pulled it. So you're not going to find it very often. They also had a sense of humor. If you remember the old comic books with the Charles Atlas ads on the back, they had some sort of equivalent on it. So somebody had it. It was clever for the day. It was just off color. About the same time I went to work for Nichols Infotech, there was a guy up in Calgary named Alfred Huger. He started his own company with a different scanner. And I thought, I know I need to use a scanner, but I don't want to use ISS because everybody's using ISS. So I went about getting in touch with this guy and started using his product, which was a product called Ballista. His company was called Secure Networks Incorporated. And Ballista was the product. Ballista is the name of that medieval giant crossbow thing. One of the guys that worked for him at Secure Networks, a gentleman that's still active in the community today, Tom Tachek, I think is how his name is pronounced. He wrote a very important booklet, research paper. It's about 80, 90 pages. I have a hard copy of it on how to evade intrusion detection. Principles still apply today, even though the technology's advanced, but it's all about detection and finding the things that are not normal. And he was just basically saying, if you've got a radar out there, you got to fly under the radar. Gross paraphrasing, but it's one of the cool things that came out of that company. Very common back in those days because vendors, there weren't that many vendors, there weren't that many cybersecurity tools and products or anything out there. And there was these big companies that wanted to be all, end all, one-stop shops and do everything security, the big guys, the IBMs and Computer Associates and Network Associates and so on and so forth. They were snatching up companies pretty much as soon as they came aboard. I would guess back in and this is late 90s at this point, the life expectancy of a decent vendor was maybe 12 to 15 months. These guys lasted about a month before they got acquired by Network Associates. Network Associates also went on a buying spree. This is an old ad from a magazine, the Info Security magazine. Again, apologize for the inappropriateness of it. At the time this came out, we were not mad that they were using scantily clad women to portray the hackers. We were mad that she was on a Windows 95 system. That's not how you hack. But they acquired McAfee, they acquired PGP. PGP was an encryption tool, is an encryption tool used to encrypt data before you send it by email. Back in the old days, there was packet sniffing was done by machine that you plugged into routers before it was just a software that you can load on your phone, and it was just applications. So they bought, Sniffer was the name of the company, and so on and so forth. Some of the companies I was more familiar with that had people that I had used to work with at NSA, very famous companies, at least for us back then, Trusted Information Systems. They were Maryland-based. They got acquired. They were pretty much the organization that put out the first, or one of the first commercial firewalls. The Wheel Group Corporation, these were guys that came out of mostly Texas. They had worked with the Air Force. The Air Force was responsible for the network back in those days, and the Air Force had a network operations center in San Antonio, Texas, as well as a security operations center. And they took some of their technologies that they designed, spun it out into the company called Wheel Group. Wheel Group lasted, again, about a year. And they were one of the first, if not the first, major acquisitions. And they were acquired by a company that to this day is trying to be a security company. I promised I'd pick on them. They're out there. Cisco. Trusted Information Systems had a guy working for him named Marcus Ranum. He's sometimes credited as being the inventor of the firewall. He will disavow that. But he did write open source firewall code that was used for decades in firewall platforms. So yeah, he did make a difference. And he did make his mark, at least on the firewall world. The team that we had put together, I mentioned TIS, I had actually interviewed there to work in their consulting group. The lady that was running the consulting group was Marcus's ex-wife. When they were acquired, Trusted Information Systems, to get their firewall. Everything else was kind of disbanded, so she went looking for a job, so we pulled her in. I had somebody there that was doing the network security for the Securities and Exchange Commission, somebody there that was doing it for the White House. We had a pretty kick-ass team, if I do say so. We used commercial war dialing products because it was very common back in those days to just not go over the internet, but to go through the phone lines to get to the computers and the networks. We used one that was called Phone Sweep, I think is what it's called. Yep. Phone Sweep I used in particular because the company was founded by a woman who had been my mentor at NSA, and I mention her every time. A woman named Becky Bass. She was a member of the Cabal of the Curmudgeons. She was actually the one that nominated me for inclusion back in 2017, which I think was in February, and she actually passed away a month later. So the last time I got to hang out with her was my induction ceremony into the Cabal of the Curmudgeons. She was truly a pioneer. She was the one at NSA that was talking to senior management about the pit, saying, I know you don't understand what they're doing. I know you think they're breaking the rules and not following protocol and procedure. Let them go. Let them do it. So she was really behind the scenes as much, if not more, than the lawyer, trying to grease the skids to let us do what we needed to be doing. I found out many years later, by the way, from a former manager at NSA, that what we did in the pit was sort of the beginnings of what is now today called the U.S. Cyber Command, for what that's worth. These are some of our clients that we had at the time. Obviously, we had some military connections. We did, but we were starting to get commercial clients. I'll skip some of the stories. Digex is one in particular I'll focus on. Digex was a hosting facility back in those days. especially web farms. If you didn't want to have all of the systems be responsible for them, you could hire these companies they would have all the servers, they would maintain all the servers, especially your web servers. So they were a colo facility, also based in Maryland. So we became partners with them, and so we were their preferred security consultants, preferred providers of vulnerability assistance, so on and so forth. I mentioned earlier that we outsourced our firewall installations. We actually outsourced them to a company called Riptech. Riptech was a company founded by a guy named Amit Yoran, who is now the CEO of Tenable. He replaced Ron Gula. I met him a couple years ago when he became on board, and I said, we never met in person, but we did work together. And he told me, oh my gosh, I kind of have you to thank for my career, because when I was first doing Riptech, I wasn't sure if this internet security, cybersecurity was going to take on, whether it was a thing. But you guys were throwing us so much work, I decided to stay with it. So he did Riptech for a while. He ended up working for a company called RSA, and now he's the CEO of Tenable. Like everybody else, Digex got acquired and rolled up into a company called Intermedia Communications. We came with them, had the co-branded marketing literature. The guy that had founded Digex, did his time at Intermedia, and then he took his proceeds and started a company called US Internetworking, or USI. Arguably one of the first, if not the first, what we would call cloud companies. Their idea back then, and this is about 1998, 1999, was, instead of all these companies having to pay for all this hardware and then pay for all this corporate enterprise software systems, Lotus Notes, accounting systems, what are the equivalents today? Salesforce type system, Outlook type systems. We'll house it, we'll have all the hardware, we'll have all the software, and we'll just lease access to it. Brilliant idea, but they needed to have security, so we were brought on to help them. I will tell the story of my favorite pen test of all time. We were given a message at some point by their security manager. We didn't really call them CISOs back then. He was fed up with trying to convince management that he needed more resources and funding and equipment. Nobody can relate to that here, right? So he asked us, you've got 48 hours, I'll give you a weekend, do as much damage as you can, break in, get as much, steal as much, not damage, but make a difference, make an impact. Also in my cleanup, I actually found the actual pen test report, which is this excerpt of this report we done. So there's the exact date is in there, September 4th, 1998, and kind of explained what we did. We got root access, we got in and did all sorts of different things. For some reason, the firewall didn't really make a difference. They actually had intrusion detection there at the time, didn't make a whole lot of difference. What we were able to do, if you read down at the bottom there, is we found a SQL server and we were able to exploit it. Can anybody tell me what we did to exploit that? Well, something called SQL injection. It's been around for a long time. If you're not familiar with it, that's okay. But back in those days, a lot of systems were Unix-based, not even Linux-based, but Unix-based. But there was also Windows. Windows was kind of up and coming. Windows NT was common. We were able to get password files from the Unix systems and crack a bunch of the passwords. Now, in defense of them, in those days, not everybody that got an account on the network was still logging in. So sometimes a default or initial account would be set up, and it was very common for the password, the initial password, to be simply the user ID. We called them Joe accounts. But if you found accounts like that, it means nobody was using it, and so you got to use it. So that was a great way to gain access. We even were cracking Windows-based passwords, so that was kind of fun. Ron Gula, who I mentioned earlier, the CEO of Tenable, the guy that worked with me in the pit, he was actually working at USI at the time, and he was so fed up with how poorly their intrusion detection systems worked that he decided he could do better. So he went off and started his own company and created actually decent functional intrusion detection system for the time called Dragon. So his company was called Network Security Wizards, and like everybody else, they were acquired after about 15 months. But he took the proceeds from that ultimately and started Tenable in, I think, 2000. He met the guy that wrote Nessus, which was an open source vulnerability scanning tool, and on it went. So I'm still friends with Ron to this day, and I like to tease him that I'm responsible for the success of his career, as is Amit. But at some point, all of us sort of got bit by the dot-com bug. Let's do something different. Let's do something on our own. And so and it was actually one of our clients, one of our customers from Digex got involved with a startup called Meta Security Group. So we popped on over to Meta Security Group, pretty much our whole practice. Not a lot of good things happened there. It was very dysfunctional. We kind of went through an identity crisis. They called us Metacess for a little while, and people said, "What? You're cancer?" It was bad. 9/11 happened that time. This was a pivotal event in the history of cybersecurity, because up until that point, that FUD that I mentioned earlier, we would try to have serious conversations about this is the bad things that could happen, and people were like, yeah, but that's not going to happen to us. That'll never happen. That's just hypothesis. The sky is falling. 9/11 happened, and all of a sudden, oh, you mean bad things can happen? I mean, up until 9/11, nobody thought that anybody would, sacrifice their life and fly an airplane into a building. I mean, there were people that did research on it. We found out later. But for the most part, at the time, you hijacked planes, you held it for ransom, you killed a couple people on the plane until you got what you wanted. Nobody thought this would happen. And this changed our discussion in terms of talking to our clients about cybersecurity and about the need to build information security programs and to build a whole program about security in their organization. And it was amazing because it lasted for probably at least 9 months before people lost sight of it. That's a joke. Some of the people that came out of Meta Security Group went on to start other companies. InGuardians is actually one of the best pen testing, red teaming companies out there. Very high end. But the guy that founded it came out of Meta Security Group. A lot of the people from my team went on to form another company, and they've been doing at the hacker conference called DEF CON. They do a password cracking contest to this day. One of the other guys is on the review board of another conference called Black Hat. I got to the point, though, and this is about 2004, still actually doing pretty good on time. I was getting frustrated because we would go in, and first we would talk to customers and just get a lay of the land, and we would know, okay, you're not secure, bad things could happen. We don't even need to do it. We can tell you how it could be done. But they would hire us to do the pen test. We'd come in every 6 months. We'd find problems. We'd come back 6 months later, find the same problem, same pad password, same weak password. So I was getting a little bit frustrated just because, my training as an analyst, as a problem solver, I wanted to try to make things better. And it didn't seem like sticking their nose in the pile of the bad pen tests was making a difference. So I was kind of trying to figure out a way to figure out how to get the message across to companies that they got to take this stuff seriously. Bad things could happen. They just can't bop along thinking bad things happen to somebody else, and it's just there but the grace of God, it happens to me. We're not targeted. I mean, literally having conversations with companies, well, why would anybody bother us? We're a clothing store. Why would anybody bother us? We're a grocery store, a food store, a manufacturer, and so on and so forth. The other thing that was happening was there was younger people coming to work, and there was more automation. I remember the last pen test I did, I was on site with a partner and a colleague, and we spent the morning trying to see what we could break into. And I'd found a couple Unix servers that had some insecure services, and I'd gotten onto like 3 or 4 services. We compared notes at lunchtime, and this guy that was younger, he said, oh yeah, I saw that. So I immediately wrote a script, and I found 95 systems that have the same problem. I'm like, okay, I'm done. So I was getting old. But more than that, I was frustrated that we weren't making a difference just breaking in and telling people what the holes were and fixing it. Along about that time, I went to work for a startup company, again, Maryland-based, called TrustWave, which immediately became Amber on TrustWave. And one of the first things that they did with me was hand this brand new thing called the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI, and said, here, read this. This is what you're going to do. 2004. I read it, and I thought, this is actually pretty decent, because it's designed to protect a specific type of information, but in terms of holistically looking at the things you need to do as an organization, it has 6 goals. Build and maintain a secure network. Build a secure network. And then the second goal, protect the sensitive data. The third goal is keep everything secure. Maintain a vulnerability management program, and that takes different forms. Limit access. Figure out who needs access to what. Need to know. Don't let people have access to the sensitive data if they don't need it. Do all the security stuff. Test and monitor. And finally, write all this stuff that you're doing down so it's repeatable and somebody else can come along and follow it and make sense of it. That's the essence of what PCI is. That was the essence of what we were trying to teach to our organizations and clients about how to build an information security program. But they just didn't listen. So I became a QSA, a Qualified Security Assessor. Over the years, these are the types of clients I've had. I've had some interesting experiences within the PCI world, right smack in the middle, TJX companies. They were famously breached back in the mid to late 2000s. I was there, I worked with them for 6 years, initially trying to get them to a point of security and then maintain it through the form of doing a compliance assessment. Heartland Payment Systems, same hacker group hit them. They were a payment processor. That's in the PCI world, that's even a bigger deal. They're a third party that's trying to help all the merchants and retailers. You've probably recognized some of those names. Some have come and gone. Some of my more notable clients, as I mentioned, New York Times was an interesting one, but I won't tell that story today. So I put all this together because 4.0 came out this year, the latest edition. PCI is now 20 years old. It's still going strong. I know you guys are public sector, but I would venture to say somewhere in your organizations, in your governments, local or state, there's somebody that's taking a credit card in order to pay for a fee or a permit or a license or a fine. So somebody in your organization is doing PCI. I encourage you to find them and find out what PCI is about, because I still stand by those 6 goals. They would apply anywhere. You just have to be smart enough to say, okay, we're not protecting credit cards in this instance. We're protecting privacy data. We're protecting research data. Whatever it is that you want to protect, those are the things you need to do fundamentally to protect it. That's my sales pitch for the day. I want to wrap up with a few things, and this will go fairly quickly because I am finally running out of time. But I think I've timed it pretty well. Because this is a keynote, I'm supposed to motivate you for the day. So here goes. This is what we were saying back in the days when we were trying to convince companies to do security, organizations to do security. This is an actual slide deck, unretouched, from 1998. So this is 26 years old, if I do the math right. We would talk about why you need to do this. We would talk about the things that are the common gotchas, what makes a network insecure. And we hammered home the fact that it all starts with policy. You have to have a plan. Don't just go out there and buy a bunch of technology and set it up, and in those days it was install a firewall and think you're done. There's a whole lot more to it than that, because the bad guys, if they're interested in getting your stuff, they're going to find a way around the things that you're doing. And it's kind of no holds barred. That was one of the fun things about being a computer network attacker, pen tester, was there were no rules. What we recommended was thinking about security as a life cycle, as a program. I still kind of believe this to this day. When we were pitching this idea of, first you gotta figure out what you have, do an inventory, figure out what your resources and assets are, not just physical assets, your information assets. What do you have that's worth protecting? What do you have that you think somebody wants to get at? These days, it's not even the data anymore, it's availability and access. The bad guys don't have to steal the data anymore. If they can keep you from being able to access it and make you pay a ransom, they've still won. So that's where the evolution has gone, not necessarily in a good way. We used to advertise this life cycle as being a 12 to 18-month process. You know, you got to review your technology, your plans, put something in place, run it for a while, then test it and assess it and audit it, and then lather, rinse, repeat. Nowadays, this cycle, while I still think it exists, it might only be a month, or it might only be a week, sometimes days, sometimes hours. But the process is still there. You got to have a plan, you got to have an approach. It's got to be necessarily written down. These are all things, by the way, that PCI requires, which made PCI very easy for me to embrace. We emphasized that if you didn't have a written plan, if all you were doing was throwing technology at the problem, you were going to lose. I hope that I am proven wrong by that statement someday, but I still kind of stand by that statement to this day. If all you're doing is throwing technology at the problem without taking into account other things, you're not winning. You need to have the technology. There's no way to avoid it, but you need to have a plan and a strategy and know what the technology is and isn't doing for you, is my premise. We try to explain what the policy is, and we really say it's foundational. You got to start with a policy, a strategy, have an idea of what you're doing, a purpose, a goal. What it's not, and unfortunately this is very often to this day still what it is. You have your documents, you have your policies, and you update them once a year. And in the old days they would collect dust on a shelf. Nowadays they're more likely electronic, so they're somewhere on some file share, and you bring them out once a year to show to the auditors. We tried to build a business case. There wasn't much law back then, but 20 years later, I think we have a better story to tell in terms of a business case, so on and so forth. Why policies fail. I'm sorry if I'm going quickly, but I'm just trying to give you the gist. Policy needs to be something, we used to preach this all the time, that security starts with the CEO. You got to have the buy-in from the executive level, otherwise nothing's going to fly. That enables enforcement. That enables, somewhere in here, is no sacred cows. I can't tell you how many organizations I went to, especially in those days, where the CEO and the executives, well, they didn't really touch that weird computer thing on their desk. They let their secretary or their assistant do it. And so the assistant had all the passwords to all the executives. Very important is I used to go into organizations to do the assessments. I would try to learn the power structure and who was the gatekeeper. Very often it wasn't the executives. It was the people working for the executives. Anyway, enforcement is key. Again, focusing on technology, bad. Keys to success, building in an idea of corporate culture. I first started working for the government, for the U.S. Navy, for a research organization, and there were tons of security rules and processes in place, mostly physical. And I was a college kid on it. I was a summer intern. I'm like, why do we have to have all these rules? There's fences, there's guards with guns, there's locked doors. I left a safe open one night, and I got a lot of trouble for it. But I learned the lesson over time that layers of security is a thing that's important, and it's important. Everybody knew what they should and shouldn't do, and knew what the rules were, and knew that they had to follow them because it contributed to some greater goal, a goal of keeping secrets. There's this no sacred cows. Unfortunately, our message then, and even to this day, isn't very well heard. We talked about, and we sort of had the approach from a military perspective, that your most sensitive assets should be way in the bowels of the castle, or electronically on the database or on the mainframe. And we need to build layers of physical, electronic, digital security around it, thus the idea of a firewall. This is an aerial shot of a town, I think it's in Italy, that was built like in the 1200s or something like that. You can see the layers of security physically. Not only were we not getting the message right, because nowadays, where's all your sacred information? It's in all the places that we used to try to protect it from. Last couple slides. These are slides I think from about 2002, 2003, from the Meta Security Group. 5 worst security mistakes end users make. Opening unsolicited email attachments. That was the problem back then. What is it today? Clicking on the link. Technology has changed slightly, still the same fundamental problem. Letting people not installing patches. How many people have patching problems in their organizations? Nobody's raising their hand? I don't believe you. Maybe it's not your responsibility. Not making and testing backups, not having backups of your data. Because at the end of the day, data is what you're trying to get at. Using a modem while connected through a local area network. Well, that may not be the case as much anymore, but we still have an issue now of Wi-Fi, and where are you plugging in your corporate laptop, and what are you connecting to? So technology's changed a little bit. I don't think the mistakes have changed a whole lot. Security mistakes that senior executives make. Anybody in here a senior executive? Pay attention. Failing to understand the role of information security to your business and putting it in the proper context. Relying primarily on a firewall, it was true then. I would just translate that into modern terms of relying primarily on technology. It's not about the technology. Pretending the problem will go away, ignore it. Nobody's going to hit us. We don't have anything worth stealing. We're just one small fish in the ocean. There's lots of other places out there that are more lucrative targets. And then finally, the 10 worst security mistakes that IT people make. How many people here are into IT? A few more. Sorry. Don't try to write all these things down or memorize them. The bonus is, in a moment, I'll show you a QR code where you can go and get a copy of these slides. I think these are useful slides to take back to your managers and coworkers and say, this is what they were talking about, some guy I listened to at a conference 20 some odd years ago. Why hasn't anything changed? Why isn't anything different? Personal note, I was in Canada a couple months ago doing work and speaking at a conference, and my customer, I had to stay a weekend, this was in Edmonton, took me to a Native American, or that's not what they call it, Indigenous People Museum. And I was reading some of the displays, and I came across a couple slides. I'll just share this one. But somebody had asked me, what does curmudgeon mean? And I was reading some of these slides, and I was like, this is kind of what I think it means to be a curmudgeon. You're an elder, you've been around long enough, you've sort of lived the life, had the experiences, and it's my job to pass that on to younger generations. And if you're older out there, it's your job to pass it on. It's how we stay alive as people. And you're not an elder or a curmudgeon just because you're old. You have to have gone through it and lived it and walked the walk. Thought this was very profound. Like indigenous people had life figured out a long time ago, and then we came along, European white people came along and screwed things up. Not making a comment or anything, but I am kind of. Focus on curmudgeon. We teach. This is how we survive as a species. This is why I talk about how we were doing this stuff a generation ago, because we haven't fundamentally shifted a whole lot, and we're not doing the things that we should have known 30 years ago that we should be doing as a whole. There's obviously exceptions. There's the QR code if you're interested in any of these slides. You can trust my QR code. Isn't that what we're supposed to say? Because don't click on the links and don't click on the QR codes. I will tell you this will take you to my company's website, and I think you will have to put in a name and an email address. It does not go to marketing people. It will go to me. Because I won't let them do that. If you're really interested in the long version of my stories, I recorded a podcast back in April called the Team House Podcast. I had never heard of them, but I met the guys that did it, and they invited me on, and they let me talk for 3 hours. So if you ever have insomnia sometime, you want to go out there, you can find that. Just type in Team House and NSA on YouTube, and you can find it, or it's on podcast version. My final message to you is don't be content to accept the status quo, question everything. This is where I'm supposed to ask for questions, but we're probably out of time. I'll leave that up to management. I went 3 minutes over, so I should shut up and leave the stage. Thank you very much for indulging me. Appreciate it.